So the sound we're about to create is actually in many ways simpler than the one we created in the first video. However, this time around we're going to get into some more complex routing between the two filters, and we're also going to get into some pitch envelope modulation as well. Now the sound I'd eventually like to create here is a zap sound. Now I know that's somewhat of a generic description, but this is a pretty abstract sound that I have in my head. The best way I can describe it is that it has a very short envelope time, so it has a short playback period. It has kind of a flangy or even phasey quality to it, and its pitch is definitely going to change in an extreme way over a short period of time. So let's get down to creating this sound and you can hear what I'm talking about. Now the first interesting part about this sound is we're only going to use one oscillator. That is, we're going to use oscillator 1. So we're going to keep the noise generator and oscillator 2 disengaged at all times. Now the way the routing for this sound eventually is going to end up is that we'll have oscillator 1 going fully into filter 1, and then filter 1 will eventually be sent completely to filter 2, and then of course the two amp envelopes will be engaged and mixed at the output to create our eventual sound. So now that we've got that little roadmap, let's move ahead. So the first important element here will be pitch modulation, although for this patch we're not going to use the pitch envelope because it's a little bit too simple for our purposes here. After all, it only determines the starting amount of the pitch and then a time over which it goes back to its normal state of 0% change. And I'd rather have something that kind of cycles up and down in an odd way to create the pitch effect that I'm looking for. So obviously our tool of choice here is going to be the LFO. Since we're dealing with the top of the shell here, as you might remember from the intro video to Analog's interface, is going to be modulated by LFO 1, and of course vice versa down here on the bottom of the shell with LFO 2. And indeed that's reflected here in the display. So the first thing I'll do is enable LFO 1, and I know I'm going to want this effect to be synchronized to any music that I might write with it, so I'm going to put this on the sync setting. And I'm also going to keep the oscillator 1 here on this sawtooth waveform. So let's hear what it sounds like now with no LFO modulation since we haven't assigned it at all. So it's a pretty simple sound as it stands. The only change I want to make here to the amp envelope is just to bring this decay out a little bit more. There we go. Now we have the sound playing back for a longer time, and that means more time for us to be able to hear this LFO effect. So let's come back to our oscillator section. I'll set the LFO rate to a fairly fast setting, and then I'll start to apply it to the pitch mod. And now I have it all the way up so that the LFO is affecting the pitch mod 100%. My only problem with this is that the effect on the pitch is not predictable every time I trigger a note. So if we come back here to the LFO section, we can remedy that problem by turning on retrig. Again, remember that setting allows you to reset the LFO's waveform every time you trigger a new note. The net result of that is that each note will have a predictable effect. Here's the difference. No retrig. And retrig. Now that we have retrig engaged, we can come over here and tweak this waveform a little bit so the pitch modulation will always start just at the right place. I actually like the way that sounds. Just a little bit of an offset, only 25 degrees into the waveform. Sounds just about how I want it to be. See the difference here. With this offset, it's actually starting up higher on the pitch modulation, which creates kind of a different attack phase for our sound in general. When I had the offset back at 0, the pitch modulation had to start from way down here and move up, so the attack phase kind of dragged out a little bit more than I wanted it to. So here's what we have. Now I'm actually really happy with the way this is sounding already, although we can add a little bit more to it to kind of add that phasey or flangy quality that I was going for. And the way I'm actually going to do that is I'm actually going to run one filter into another and have them kind of clash against one another. So as you can see here, oscillator 1 is feeding filter 1 100%. So I'm going to enable filter 1, and I'm going to set it to a high pass filter setting so it kind of brings the lows in and out. And I'm going to set it to a 24 decibel per octave high pass filter to make it kind of squelchy. So you're not going to hear anything now that you trigger this sound because all of the audible frequencies are being filtered out. As I bring the frequency down, you'll start to hear more and more of the sound. Now I'll add a little bit more flavor by bringing the resonance control up. And I'll bring resonance up even higher. And now the sound is almost taking on a drum-like quality in the mid-range. Now I'm going to assign a little bit of the filter envelope to give it a little bit more movement. Now I'm only going to assign this to 1. Remember, the maximum value for this setting is 16, so it's only letting the envelope affect the sound a little bit. I'm going to drag up this attack time, again keeping the envelope on the exponential mode. And I'm going to bring this decay up a little bit. And even just that little bit of movement added into the sound had quite an effect. But I don't even feel like stopping there. I like the fact that we can scale the frequency not just by the envelope, but also by the LFO over here. So let's add in a little bit of the LFO to the filter frequency as well. Let's try it at different octaves. So that takes on a drastically different timbre even depending on which octave you're playing it in. So again, make sure you're realizing that the effects of both the filter envelope as well as LFO1 are mixing together to create a really interesting modulation on the cutoff frequency of filter 1. One of the limitations of analog is that two modulators can't modulate one another. Well, this is almost the same thing. Here we're just taking the two modulators and rather than having them affect one another, they're both having an effect on this audible parameter up here, the cutoff frequency. And this is an area where it really pays to experiment quite a bit. You can even add in some key scaling here, making the sound brighter or warmer depending on whether you're playing higher or lower on the keyboard, although I'm going to leave off key scaling for this particular sound. The next step is to add even more character into the filter work we're doing here by adding in filter 2. Now I'm just going to want to route all of filter 1 to filter 2, so I'm going to drag it up to 100%. Now on filter 2 we're going to use another high pass filter, although this time let's actually mix our filter types and use a 12 decibel per octave high pass filter. Also remember to turn on your amp envelope here. Now I want to make this filter a little bit less jarring. As you can see, it's actually running pretty hard into the limiter here, and the limiter is having to do a lot of gain reduction. And one way we can at least soften that effect, besides just bringing the volumes down on the amp envelopes, which you could do as well, is to actually have this filter envelope fade in a little bit. So I'm going to bring up this attack, again leaving it on the exponential envelope setting, and also bringing this decay out a little bit. I'm going to bring up the envelope setting to full, so that now the filter envelope is fully affecting filter 2. And just with that little bit of work, we have a pretty cool squelchy zap sound here that we could use as a special effect in a piece of music or elsewhere. And again, you have a very different effect depending on which octave you're playing in, mostly because we're using high pass filters here. So if you're playing lower notes that by definition have lower frequencies, of course the high pass filter is going to interact with those in a very different way than higher notes. Here I'm playing in the low octaves, actually 4 octaves below middle C. And now of course I'm increasing the octave that I'm playing in. So you can see there are a lot of possibilities here. I definitely try to play this over the full range. The next thing I'll do is just group these two into a new instrument rack. And let's take a look at a few helpful macro knob mappings Remember, one of the cool things about these macro knobs, besides the stuff I told you about in the last video, is actually probably the most obvious feature, and that is there are 8 knobs that are sitting here all right next to one another, waiting to be tweaked and even recorded into your arrangement view. What that means is that the macro knobs represent a convenient interface into changing your sound in real time while you're recording, without having to resort to going through the obviously more complex interface of the analog device itself. The first 2 knobs I'd map here would be for LFO1, since LFO1 is obviously creating a lot of the animation of this sound. I would map macro 1 to the offset. That'll allow you to create a very different effect on the attack phase. And next I would map, of course, the rate control to another knob. The last extremely helpful control that I could see mapping here would be the decay on the first amp envelope here. So if I just map that by right-clicking, clicking on macro 3 here, and of course you could map the full bevy of envelope controls here, but for something like this you're going to want to keep it pretty minimal. Now of course there are other parameter combinations that we could get into that would be great to relate to one another on these macro knobs. For instance, you might want to try enabling LFO2, having it modify something, and then controlling the rates of both LFO2 and 1 with one macro knob. Or you might want to try relating envelope parameters to one another. And what I mean by that is, for instance, taking one macro knob and mapping it both to, say, the decay on amplitude envelope 1 and the attack setting for the filter envelope. And while that might seem like kind of an odd combination of parameters to be moving around with one knob, you might find that you're very pleasantly surprised with the timbral diversity that you can pull out of just a simple mapping like that. Again, I want to keep focusing on the idea that these macro knobs can open up possibilities in this instrument that wouldn't have been there before, just because of the practical limitations of the interface. And sometimes this level of simplicity is exactly what you should be going for. Remember, the point of sound design is not to do absolutely the most complex thing that you can think of every time, but merely to keep adding layers of complexity onto something until it becomes satisfactory to you. The danger with adding too much complexity is that the sound itself becomes very hard to mix in with other instruments. So as with all things in life, it's a real balancing act. And there we have it, a nice squelchy zap sound that could fit into a variety of situations, and a few performance parameters mapped over here for easy access.